One of the most infamous cases of an active shooting, and one that had a big influence on my book, was the 1966 University of Texas tower shooting. A man named Charles Whitman made his way to the observation deck of the tower on campus, over 200 feet in the air, and went on a sniping spree, taking the lives of students, professors, and others at random. On that hot August day, with his view from the deck and excellent aim, some victims were shot from as far as 500 yards away. Though not the first active shooting, and not the first school shooting, it is one of the first of the modern era, as news of the event quickly spread through radio and television, even while it was still happening, shocking people around the world. The event drew a lot of speculation about what caused Whitman, described as an all-American boy, to commit such violence. This video will cover Whitman's life, from growing up in Florida to taking classes in Austin, his sniping spree, and efforts by the police and civilians to stop him. The bulk of the information comes from a book titled A Sniper in the Tower by Gary Laverne, along with other sources linked below. Charles Whitman was born in Florida in 1941, the oldest of 3 boys. His father was also named Charles Whitman, so I'll refer to him as his father. His father, who had very little education, started a plumbing contracting business that became successful and made the Whitmans fairly wealthy. Though his father provided for his family materially, with a nice home, a swimming pool, and new cars, he was highly abusive. Whitman's father regularly beat his wife and his 3 sons, using belts, paddles, and his fists. Whitman's mother, Margaret, was 18 when she had Charles. A devout Roman Catholic, she raised her 3 sons Catholic. They attended Mass often, and the 3 boys went to Catholic schools. Whitman was even an altar boy. Though the family did move around when Whitman was young, they eventually settled in Lake Worth, Florida. His father was a gun enthusiast. The Whitman house was full of guns, and Father Whitman taught his sons how to use firearms at a young age. By the time Charles was a teenager, he was accurate and experienced with firearms. His father pushed his oldest son to succeed. Charles joined the Boy Scouts and became an Eagle Scout when he was 12, one of the youngest ever. He also earned great grades in school and was a well-behaved, socially engaged student. He had a measured IQ of 139. When Charles was 17, he went out with his buddies one night and came home drunk. His father exploded in rage, badly beat Charles, and tossed him into the swimming pool, where he came close to drowning. Not long after, Charles turned 18 and joined the Marines to get away from his father. In the Marines, Whitman followed orders well, earned several medals, and scored very well in marksmanship. He kept copious notes on his training and grew to be 6 feet tall and about 200 pounds. Whitman wasn't always a serious overachiever. He goofed off with friends, took risks, and drove recklessly, sometimes getting into car accidents and getting tickets. While stationed at Guantanamo Bay, Whitman applied for and received a military scholarship to get an engineering degree, with the plan of then becoming a commissioned officer. In 1961, he moved into a dorm at the University of Texas in Austin and began attending classes as a mechanical engineering major. For his entire life, Whitman had either been under the strict control of his father or the Marines. Then, as a student, he finally had a good deal of freedom. With this new freedom, Whitman repeatedly got himself into trouble. He poached a deer with some friends and brought it into the dorm shower to process it, but got caught. He also started playing poker for pretty sizable sums of money, and one time got into gambling debt with criminals who threatened him with a knife. Whitman enjoyed telling jokes, playing pranks, and even made comments about how one person could fight off an entire army from the tower on campus. The tower, built in the 1930s as part of the New Deal, already had a tragic history of people accidentally falling or intentionally jumping from it. It wasn't unusual for people to make dark jokes about it, and nobody thought much about Whitman's comments on the tower. During this time, Whitman kept in contact with his family and went on some hunting trips with his father. Early in '62, Whitman met a young woman named Kathy, and they began dating. Kathy, an attractive, well-liked, and well-behaved student, was studying to become a teacher. Whitman fell for her. About 6 months later, they got married. Unlike his academic performance before college, Whitman's grades tanked at UT. By early 1963, he lost the scholarship, dropped out of UT, and went back to active duty at Camp Lejeune in North Carolina. His wife Kathy stayed in Austin and continued taking classes. Whitman was promoted to Lance Corporal, but kept getting into trouble. He gambled more, got into fights, and made threats. One time, he was beaten by another group of Marines who kicked him in his head, and Whitman had symptoms of a concussion, experiencing headaches and dizziness. Late in '63, Whitman was court-martialed by the Marines for several offenses, including gambling, and was found guilty on all counts. He was demoted to private and sent to a military prison for a short sentence, where he started a journal. In the journal, he expressed his love for his wife, who wanted him to quit gambling, which he promised to stop doing, and also wrote about how he wanted to get out of the Marines. Whitman asked his father for help on this, and his father was able to pull some political strings and get him honorably discharged late in '64. Whitman returned to Austin, and he and Kathy moved into an apartment. Whitman resumed classes, this time as an architectural engineering major, and worked a series of low-paying jobs. Whitman was very frustrated with his life at this point. He badly wanted to surpass his father in every way, seeking ways to make as much money as possible so he could provide for his wife and future children. But other than formal education, Whitman was far behind his father in accomplishments. In his writings, he kept committing to be a more productive and better person. He would write out self-help lists that functioned as advice to himself on how to be a better husband, stay out of trouble, and stay focused on the goals that he set for himself. Whitman's problem was that he couldn't stick to his plans and kept messing up. Though often described as polite by people who knew him, his short temper and impulsivity could cause problems. Whitman's grades were better than his first stint at UT, improving so much through 1965 that he made the honor roll. But there were still struggles. He could be a difficult student and took his grades and studying very seriously, to the point he was seen as intense and overly stressed due to the pressure he put on himself. One time, he slammed his fist on the table after getting a poor grade. In another episode, while driving with an engineering friend, Whitman had a case of road rage so severe he took off his rings and got out of his car, fully ready to fistfight another driver, who quickly drove away. Through his wife's Methodist church, Whitman became the scoutmaster of a Boy Scout troop. He did an excellent job of teaching the young scouts about firearms and displayed impressive accuracy, able to repeatedly hit a clothespin with a .22 caliber rifle at around 80 feet. On the other hand, he was known to be an impatient leader who would get very angry over any criticism or disagreements. He quit as scoutmaster in early '66 due to mounting stress from his schoolwork and job. Whitman did not share his mother's Catholic beliefs, nor did he share his wife's Methodist beliefs. He had developed his own view that Earth itself was hell, and God was all matter and energy in the universe, rather than a being with strict rules on how to behave. Around this time, Whitman developed severe, frequent headaches, would sweat a lot even when the weather was cold, and gained a lot of weight, losing the physique he had in the Marines. Though he kept planning to lose the weight and get in shape, he never did. His plans for his career constantly changed. He talked about going to law school, got a real estate license but never actually conducted any real estate business, and worked a variety of jobs. His last job, during the summer of '66, involved studying the control of vehicle traffic for an engineering professor. Kathy, who had been a student teacher, graduated in '65 and continued teaching while picking up additional jobs during the summer. She provided the health insurance and most of the money for the couple. In addition, Whitman's father gave him a couple $100s per month. He found it embarrassing and frustrating that he had to rely on his wife and his father to pay the bills when he wanted to be the provider. Though Whitman kept a seemingly cordial relationship with his father, Whitman began to resent and then hate his father for the abuse he had inflicted on him and his mother. Whitman admitted he would lose his temper with his wife and would yell to scream at her when enraged. He admitted he was violent towards her at least twice, and wrote about his efforts to control his anger and treat his wife better. He felt terrible that he was emulating his father's abuse of his mother. The couple kept their discord mostly private. Many of their friends had no idea there was abuse going on, though Kathy did tell a few people. In spring of '66, Charles and Kathy moved out of their tiny apartment and rented a small house not too far from the university. The couple got to know their neighbors and were viewed as a happy, fun couple. Whitman owned multiple firearms and was often seen taking them to gun ranges. In the spring semester, Whitman completed 19 credit hours of courses and 14 credit hours for the summer, along with his part-time job on the traffic study. The combination of multiple tough classes and a job kept him busy and very stressed. Then something else happened with his family that only piled on more stress. In March of '66, Whitman's mother, Margaret, who was still living with his father in Florida, called Whitman. After years of enduring abuse and threats from her husband, Margaret wanted to get away from him. Whitman called the police in Florida to report the threats, then quickly drove from Austin to Florida, picked up his mother, and drove her back to Austin. Margaret got a job in Austin, moved into an apartment, and wanted to make the separation from her husband permanent. Whitman's father, who was still providing for his family financially, called Whitman frequently to try to convince him to tell his mother to move back to Florida. In fact, his father called so many times, he racked up thousands of dollars of phone bill charges. Though Whitman never tried to tell his mother to go back, it added even more stress to his life. Whitman experienced episodes of depression and anxiety during this time. He believed he was under too much stress and there was something wrong with his brain. His wife encouraged him to see someone and thought he could be in danger of harming himself. During one episode, Whitman confessed to a teacher that he hated his father and had a desire to kill him. During another, he wanted to drop all of his classes, sell all of his books, leave his wife, and leave Austin, surprising his wife and friends. A teacher talked to Whitman and allowed him to miss his classes as long as he remained a student and continued his other classes, and Whitman agreed. Whitman began taking amphetamines like Dexedrine that he bought illegally. There are conflicting reports about how much he used and how much they affected him, but it's clear that Whitman took them to focus and perform better at his schoolwork. He sometimes would spend multiple days in a row on campus studying, completing assignments, and taking exams. In addition, he took other pills for his severe headaches, which may have been caused by the amphetamines. After his mother traveled to Austin and his father started bombarding him with phone calls, Whitman took his wife's advice and saw a doctor. The doctor referred him to a psychiatrist at the University of Texas. Whitman spoke at length with the psychiatrist about his many issues. He admitted that he had hit Kathy twice and hated the fact that he was following in his father's footsteps, but did say that he was no longer violent towards his wife and was making progress with his self-control. Whitman went over his parents separating and his desire to accomplish more than his father had, along with his feelings of inadequacy because he had accomplished so little. He had a lot of negative feelings about his father, going on tirades insulting and criticizing him. Whitman also stated that he thought he was changing and wasn't acting like himself, and mentioned going to the top of the tower and shooting people. However, many students had made twisted jokes and offhand comments about the tower to the psychiatrist, so he didn't think too much of it. Whitman had been making similar comments all the way back to his first time at UT, and nobody thought he had been serious. The psychiatrist noted that Whitman had a lot of hostility and was self-centered and depressed, but also committed to improving his life and was not a danger to himself and others, so he recommended that Whitman come back for another session and to call him if Whitman needed somebody to talk to. Whitman would never come back. In July of '66, Richard Speck, a drug addict, broke into an apartment in Chicago and murdered 8 student nurses. News of the mass murder spread quickly through the media and shocked the nation for its brutality and random nature. It was deemed the crime of the century, and Whitman definitely would have heard of it. Around the time this story was breaking, Whitman visited the observation deck of the tower with his youngest brother, Johnny Mike. He had visited the deck many times as did other students, for the great view and to relax and collect his thoughts. The week before the Rampage, which was August 1st, went normally for Whitman. He worked his job for the traffic study and focused on his classes and studying. The first sign he had decided to commit his violent spree was the day before, July 31st, a Sunday, when he bought a Bowie knife and binoculars that he would bring with him to the tower. Those who interacted with him on that day said he was calm and quiet, a change from his usual tense and stressed demeanor. On the evening of July 31st, Whitman wrote a letter attempting to explain his actions. He wrote that he had been recently having irrational thoughts and violent impulses he couldn't explain. To quote one section, "I don't really understand myself these days. I'm supposed to be an average, reasonable, and intelligent young man. However, lately, I can't recall when it started. I've been a victim of many unusual and irrational thoughts. These thoughts constantly recur, and it requires a tremendous mental effort to concentrate on useful and progressive tasks." He asked for an autopsy to see if there was anything wrong with him, and brought up his severe headaches, though he did not mention the amphetamines he had been taking. In clear and direct writing, he confessed that he planned on killing his wife, admitted that he still loved her, and said it was to save her from the embarrassment of his actions, and as a mercy killing, so that she would not suffer in this world. These were the same reasons he was going to kill his mother. In the middle of writing this letter, a close friend and his wife stopped by his house. Kathy was still at work, so the three of them talked for a while. Whitman was oddly calm and seemed relieved, talking about how much he felt for his wife. His friends thought he was being a bit weird, but left a little later in the evening. Whitman drove to his wife's workplace, picked her up, and drove back home. He then called his mother and asked to come over to her apartment and study. Margaret's apartment had air conditioning, while Whitman's house didn't, and that summer had been exceptionally hot, with highs in the triple digits. Kathy had work the next morning, so she went to bed and Whitman drove to his mother's. Just after midnight on August 1st, Whitman arrived at his mother's apartment and quickly killed her. It's not known exactly how he did this. No autopsy was performed on his mother. She had wounds to her head and chest. Neighbors did not hear anything, so it's unlikely he used firearms. There was also damage to her left hand and her engagement ring, which had been struck with so much force the diamond had separated from the ring. He wrote another note in the apartment declaring that his hatred of his father was indescribable, that his father had abused her for decades, and explained that he had done this to free her from suffering and loved her dearly. Whitman made efforts to hide evidence of the crime and left a handwritten note asking not to be disturbed on the apartment door. Whitman came back to his house after 2 a.m. and fatally stabbed his wife while she was sleeping. He resumed finishing the letter he was writing earlier, writing more about how his father beat his mother at least once a month and did not provide for her. Though there is good evidence that Whitman's father was physically abusive, his father did financially and materially support his wife, even after she moved to Austin. Whitman finished the letter asking that his debts be paid off and any remaining money be donated toward mental health. Quote, "Donate the rest anonymously to a mental health foundation. Maybe research can prevent further tragedies of this type." However, he had almost no money, and his letter did not say anything about the tower or attacking the university. He wrote a few more letters to family members. The one to his father was not released to the public. Whitman then made preparations for the tower. On the morning of the 1st, Whitman visited multiple stores and purchased guns and ammo to supplement what he already owned. One of these was a semi-automatic 12-gauge shotgun, which he took home and sawed off the barrel and stock. Neighbors saw him carrying the guns, but knew he was a veteran who liked to hunt and go to the range, so they didn't think it was odd. The postman even commented that his shotgun was illegally modified, to which Whitman replied that he could do what he wanted to his own gun. In total, he brought 7 guns with him to the tower: 3 handguns, the shotgun, and 3 rifles. Of the 3 rifles, only one was accurate over long distances: a 6mm Remington bolt-action rifle equipped with a 4-power scope. This rifle, used for deer hunting, would be Whitman's main weapon when firing from the tower. The second rifle was a .30 caliber semi-automatic M1 carbine, which had a faster rate of fire, but much shorter effective range. The third rifle was a pump-action .35 caliber Remington. Whitman grabbed his footlocker from his time in the Marines and filled it with a large amount of supplies, ranging from a radio to matches, knives, water, gasoline, food, tools, ammunition, rope, a compass, and much more. He packed so much, he must have been expecting to last on the tower for more than one day. Whitman called his wife's and mother's workplaces and said they were sick and wouldn't be coming in. He donned coveralls to look like a maintenance worker, rolled a blanket around his long guns, then packed the guns, his footlocker, and a two-wheel dolly into his car and drove to campus. Because Whitman did work on campus as part of his traffic safety job, he was able to get a loading zone permit from a security guard on campus and park near the tower at about 11:30 a.m. Everyone around assumed he was there to make some repairs. He took his dolly up the elevator to the 27th floor. He had to pull his dolly up the stairs to the 28th, which had the observation deck. He bludgeoned the receptionist unconscious and dragged her behind a couch, leaving a path of blood on the floor. She would pass away later in the day. A couple coming in from the deck walked in on Whitman holding two of his guns. They greeted him politely, and Whitman asked them how they were doing. Though they thought it was odd for a man to have guns there, they didn't ask why and instead stepped over the dark stain on the floor and headed down the stairs. After Whitman blocked the stairs with office furniture, a group of 6 relatives who were visiting the tower for a view of Austin came up the stairs and were confused about the makeshift barrier. Whitman noticed them and with his sawed-off shotgun fired multiple rounds, killing 2 and seriously injuring 2 more. All 4 of them slid down the stairs, bleeding profusely. The final pair of visitors, 2 men whose wives and sons had just been shot, were further behind and were not hit. They went to get help in the tower. It was clear Whitman wanted to first eliminate anybody else on the 28th floor and block off the only access point, the stairs, before firing from the tower. The observation deck ran around the 28th floor in the shape of a square. A 4-foot-high, thick limestone wall around the deck provided cover for Whitman. The wall was completely solid except for small rain spouts that Whitman used as gun ports once people on the ground started firing back. The deck could only be accessed from one door, which Whitman propped his dolly against. Years earlier, he had identified the deck as an easily defendable position, even for one person, and had clearly planned his actions on August 1st ahead of time. He put on a bandana to keep sweat out of his eyes and readied his bolt-action rifle. His father had given him years of experience and training in firearms during his boyhood. Then the Marines gave him even more years. And after the Marines, he continued with hunting and trips to the range. Whitman was 25 years old and had almost 25 years of firearms experience. During his 96-minute rampage, he would prove to be extremely accurate. The first 20 minutes were the deadliest, as return fire from civilians and police picked up and forced him to move frequently and stay low. The surrounding area was blocked off, and news of the danger spread. Whitman's first victim was an 18-year-old pregnant woman. He shot her in the abdomen, ending the unborn baby's life. The mother would survive the shooting. Given Whitman's skill and the aid of his scope, it is likely that Whitman targeted the unborn child. The next shot instantly killed the woman's boyfriend, who was trying to help her. A physics professor nearby saw the couple dropping, and before he could find cover, was also fatally shot. This video won't go over every person who was hit, as there were dozens, but focus on the most notable aspects of the crime. The couple who had greeted Whitman at the top of the tower exited the building, heard gunshots, and found cover. They would survive the attack. Those in and around campus heard the gunfire and had a variety of responses. Some thought it might have been construction, as construction noises were very common on campus. Others, who saw people falling down or laying on the ground, assumed it was an elaborate prank. Some believed it was some sort of play or practice being put on by drama students, and some figured out pretty quickly that it was a sniper shooting people and called police. Whitman moved around the deck, firing once and then picking a new spot, using the wall as cover, giving many people the impression that there were actually multiple shooters. People on the ground who saw the victims falling took cover behind walls, large statues, or cars, and warned others close by. They would have to stay crouched or hunched behind cover for a long time in the baking heat. One woman in an air-conditioned building didn't hear the gunshots, but did see people falling down. She ran out to help, figured out what was happening, and had to take cover. She was unable to help the wounded close to her because they were out in the open. Most of the victims of the sniping were students in their upper teens or 20s. Whitman chose his targets at random, hitting whoever he could see, and on a college campus, most of the people around were in that age range. Once he did hit somebody and they went down, he didn't bother shooting them again to make sure that they were dead. Several people who were shot and injured lay on the ground, pretending to be dead, out in the open, and survived. Whitman tended to aim for the chest. He may have been following a one-shot, one-kill mentality seen in the military. Due to the extreme heat and duration of the shooting, the victims who did lay on the concrete would suffer second-degree burns. Some were even seen by witnesses periodically lifting their limbs off of the concrete by small amounts to stop the burning without attracting the sniper's attention. 2 unarmed UT security officers were ordered to go to the tower. One of them had issued the permit to Whitman earlier that day. They went to the 27th floor and met one of the men from the group of 6 visitors who was covered in his family member's blood and demanded a gun to get vengeance. Then they went back down, turned off the elevators, and told people in the tower to hide. Whitman turned his attention to the Drag, a busy street west of the tower with a lot of pedestrians and businesses. Whitman began shooting pedestrians there, and with a greater level of background noise from the busy street, people had a hard time telling what was going on. Multiple students and teenagers were hit, and pedestrians rushed to help those who had fallen and warned others of the danger, some unaware of where the shots were coming from. Though there were many cars still driving on the street, Whitman did not shoot any of them, instead targeting pedestrians he could see. One young man on the Drag, Paul Sontag, took cover behind a barricade, but then moved it to look at the tower. He told his classmate he could see the sniper on the tower. Paul's mouth hung open, and a round went right through it. Paul's girlfriend was close by, and the classmate tried to stop her from coming to Paul's aid. Whitman's next bullet hit both the girlfriend and the classmate, piercing the classmate's fingers before ending the girlfriend's life. This was a common theme during the sniping, where one person would get hit, somebody else would go to their aid, and they would be shot too. Another example of this also happened on the Drag, when 3 young men were all wounded in front of a store. The store owner, who saw them struggling to get into the store, at first believed it was a prank. After noticing the tremendous amount of blood, he realized it wasn't fake, and pulled the wounded men into the store as Whitman continued firing at them. The store owner was wounded in the process, but all 4 of them did survive. Further south of the tower, an electrician hid behind a car with others after someone had warned him of a sniper. Believing he was too far out of range, he stood up, and in the middle of remarking that they were safe because they were too far away, a bullet hit him in the chest and would prove to be fatal. He was over 500 yards away from the tower, and the greatest distance from the tower among those who died. Back on the Drag, a customer at a barber shop watched the chaos from the door, thinking he was far enough to be out of range. Whitman shot him in the shoulder, at a distance even further from the tower than the electrician. This was the longest hit of the sniping spree. As more and more police officers and civilians with guns returned fire at the tower, Whitman relied more on his semi-auto M1 carbine than his bolt action. He used the faster rate of fire to force them to take cover, and tried to prevent them from getting into the tower. Because this was Texas, plenty of civilians grabbed their firearms, mostly hunting rifles, from their vehicles or homes, and from areas all around campus, they returned fire at Whitman. Some would join police officers, or hand their weapons to officers, or be encouraged to shoot by police officers, eventually bringing so much fire on the tower that Whitman had to contend with a semi-steady rain of bullets pulverizing chunks of limestone around him. This is why most of the victims were shot early in the rampage, because later, Whitman had to use the rain spouts and could not take his time to aim, as those firing back learned to target the spouts. Somehow, no one was hit by the return fire, though there were some close calls and worrying anecdotes. One civilian had put an M14 rifle on a tripod. Another gave a reporter a handgun, and students started asking officers for guns. There was one story of a man with a rifle who rushed into a cafe near campus, bought a six-pack, and quickly left. Some made their way onto the roofs of buildings, creating a ring of fire around the tower. However, not all the civilians had great aim, and some even used handguns and shotguns to fire at a distant tower, and some shots landed below the observation deck, risking going through a window and hitting a civilian taking cover or an officer working their way up to the deck. One officer even ran around telling everyone to aim for the observation deck after hearing on the radio that shots were coming in low. Later on, the police chief did not condemn the civilians who shot back, but did say it was stupid to go towards the campus. There were also instances of civilians and officers risking their lives to evacuate the wounded who were still exposed to Whitman. Some employees of an armored car company drove their armored cars to campus, loaded up victims with the help of others, and drove them to a hospital. Many ambulance paramedics risked their lives to load up victims in range of Whitman. One was shot and injured and transported to the hospital in his own ambulance. Basically, every doctor, nurse, and student nurse in Austin showed up at the emergency room of the hospital to help out, and their help would be needed, as the emergency room was overwhelmed with victims, police, relatives, the press, and people who wanted to donate blood. Most of the victims had life-threatening injuries or were dead on arrival. There were so many ambulances, they just started parking in the middle of the street. Alan Crum, a civilian working at a business on the drag and who had served in the Air Force, recognized the gunshots. He ran all over the drag, helping victims and telling people to take cover. Eventually, he moved towards the tower, waited for Whitman to begin firing in a different direction, and ran into the tower. Inside, he told officers he wanted to help. They gave him a rifle. The Austin Police Department's response to the shooting was disorganized, to say the least. The higher-ups never created or implemented a solid plan to take out the sniper. Officers acted and reacted in a piecemeal fashion. Many of them did not have radios they could take with them. Once they left their vehicles to move around campus, they could only communicate with those nearby. A small number had handheld radios, but they were not reliable. Another problem the police had was the lack of firepower. Most officers only had revolvers or shotguns, which were ineffective from the ground. Many off-duty officers would respond too, and some even brought their personal hunting rifles to take shots at Whitman. Others focused on blocking off streets and warning pedestrians, trying to eliminate any more potential targets for Whitman, and some worked their way into the tower. East of the tower, 2 armed off-duty officers worked with a civilian who had a telescope. They watched the rain spouts and fired at Whitman when they could see him. South of the tower, a group of officers from different agencies, including a Secret Service agent, armed with a variety of rifles, carefully watched for a barrel to come out of one of the rain spouts. One of the officers in the group used binoculars and called out what he saw. There were giant clocks on every side of the tower, and at one point, he noticed an object below one of the giant clocks. Another officer was able to shoot the object, which turned out to be the .35 caliber Remington rifle. The damage rendered it useless. An officer/pilot and another officer with a rifle got in a small airplane in an attempt to snipe Whitman from the air. However, the extreme heat surging up from all of the concrete caused severe turbulence, so the officer decided not to fire because he couldn't aim. Whitman did fire at the plane, though, and put some holes in it. The officers flew further away and weren't harmed. Officer Speed, a rookie police officer with the Austin Police Department, had been considering quitting the force due to low pay. He was on duty when multiple calls on his radio for all officers to respond to the campus came through. Officer Speed parked and made his way on foot behind a wall near the tower where there were civilians. On top of the wall was a sort of concrete fence for the higher level of campus around the tower. There were gaps between the concrete pillars about 4 to 6 inches across. Whitman fired through one of the gaps and hit Officer Speed. Another officer had to run back to a building to find a telephone in order to report that an officer was shot. Officers and several civilians helped Speed, some of them bravely running across open ground to get to him, but ultimately, Speed did not make it. Officer Martinez was off duty at his house with the TV on when news broke that people were being shot at UT. He called in and received orders to stop traffic around campus. By the time Martinez got to the campus, civilians had stopped traffic on their own, so Martinez made his way from cover to cover until he reached a point where he had to move across an open area to get to the tower, an open area with several victims. He then charged toward the tower, but instead of moving in a straight line, he weaved back and forth, abruptly changing his angles to make himself a more difficult target. He was so focused on running, he couldn't tell if Whitman tried to hit him. A little before Martinez, a different officer had done the same thing, and witnesses spotted dust rising from the ground as Whitman tried and failed to hit the weaving officer. Officer McCoy was on duty when a panicked dispatcher came over the radio and alerted him to the tower. He had quite a journey just getting into the tower. He initially couldn't find an entrance, so he started asking students if they had any rifles, because McCoy didn't have one. He found a student who had one at his apartment, drove the student to his apartment, found out the student didn't have any ammo, drove to a store and purchased ammo, and moved with the student to a place on campus where they could see the tower. McCoy wasn't familiar with the scope and gave it back to the student to use. He witnessed Officer Speed go down, told the student to shoot the sniper, then left and found other officers to see if there was a plan to get the sniper, and there didn't seem to be any. He drove a different student with a rifle to a store to buy ammo again, told him to go and shoot the sniper, then found a group of officers who were gathering to make their way into the tower. Looking for an alternative to running in full view of the sniper, they found a UT employee who led them through the complex maintenance tunnels that ran under the campus. Though there were a lot of people involved in the efforts to take out Whitman at the top of the tower, I'm going to focus on 3 of them: Officer Martinez, Officer McCoy, and Alan Crum. In a haphazard and disjointed way, officers and Crum made their way up the tower to the 27th floor. Coordination and communication were lacking. McCoy went up in the elevator with his group. He pointed his shotgun at the elevator doors for whatever might come. There was still a belief that there were multiple shooters. When the doors opened, Officer Day, who had run into the building over open ground like Martinez, was pointing his gun right back at them. Also, most officers assumed that Alan Crum was an officer, since he was holding a gun. Luckily, Day told McCoy that there was a civilian on their side, or else McCoy would have shot Crum, because Crum wore civilian clothes and carried a rifle, just like the shooter. On the 27th floor, the man who had asked for a gun earlier from the unarmed guards again said he wanted to get revenge, but an officer took him to a lower floor. Crum and Martinez went up the stairs to the 28th floor ahead of the others. They found out there was only one shooter by asking one of the critically injured visitors. Martinez and Crum, both veterans, used their military training to cover each other and advance to the 28th floor. Behind them, McCoy and his group moved the 2 injured visitors, a mother and son, down to the 27th floor. The son, using foul language, cursed out the shooter and asked for a gun. His mother, despite everything that happened, scolded her son for using foul language. I made a simplified map of the 28th floor and the surrounding deck. The dark gray is the exterior wall, the outer tan square is the deck, the red is an inaccessible storage area, and the light blue is the accessible part of the floor. There is only one door to the deck in the southeast corner. Martinez took the lead and pushed open the door to the deck, creating a racket with the dolly leaning against it. McCoy and other officers caught up and were afraid the noise would attract the sniper. It didn't. Whitman was on the northwest corner at the time, far from the door. There were two other sounds that likely prevented Whitman from hearing the dolly. One was all of the return fire, and the second was his radio. Whitman had turned up the volume of live news coverage of his own shooting. Martinez went north on the east side of the tower on his own initiative. Crum and another officer stood by the door and watched the southwest corner. McCoy followed Martinez. They did not talk this out ahead of time, except that Crum was told to stay by the door and watch the corner. Another officer watched out the window on the west side. McCoy wanted to take things slow, but the advance was fast and improvised. The plan, if you could call it that, was simple. The southwest corner would be held down while two officers went around the deck. They would meet the sniper one way or the other. Martinez only had his revolver, and McCoy had a pump-action shotgun. Martinez crawled, and McCoy crouched as they moved because of the relentless incoming fire from the ground. They had to move carefully to avoid the bullets hitting the wall and spraying limestone around them. This map does not show it, but the huge clocks on the exterior walls partially obstructed the view down each side, creating some potential cover for the sniper. Back by the door, Crum was briefly distracted by the rifle that had been shot and damaged earlier. Whitman then began moving south from the northwest corner. Crum, who had never used the rifle the officer gave to him, heard footsteps and accidentally shot at the southwest corner. Whitman heard this and went back to the northwest corner and aimed his M1 at the southwest corner. Martinez rounded the northeast corner, saw Whitman, fired every round from his revolver at him, and missed. Whitman attempted to pivot to the east, but struggled to do this and fired into the air. McCoy came up behind Martinez and fired twice. The first round of buckshot struck Whitman directly in the face, which turned, and the second round hit him in the head. Whitman began thrashing around. Martinez tossed his revolver and, without asking, took the shotgun from McCoy, charged towards Whitman while yelling, and fired into Whitman's arm. Whitman was then still. Martinez stood back up, attracting more gunfire from the ground, then moved to the southwest corner to tell everyone. However, Crum and the other officers were expecting the sniper to come around that corner, and they almost fired at Martinez. Officers waved handkerchiefs and towels to signal to those firing at them, but the gunfire continued. Word would slowly spread, and eventually the bullets did stop hitting the tower. People came out from cover from all around campus, forming a large crowd that watched as the injured and dead were moved out of the tower. Martinez and McCoy were both shaken up from the violence. Martinez suffered from shakes, dry heaving, and exhaustion, to the point of needing assistance. He downed a bottle of gin to calm himself. Across the globe, news programs covered the sniping, with some local stations covering it live on the radio and TV. A local TV station reporter read out loud the names of the deceased before the families had been notified. The anchor stopped the reporter and asked for the names to be read again, because one of the names sounded like his grandson. It turned out that the young man who had been shot in the mouth was the anchor's grandson. Journalists compared the attack to the recent Richard Speck killing spree of nursing students, and both crimes dominated the news cycle. The Soviet Union touted the two acts as evidence that America was full of violence. Whitman's father, who was in Florida, told police that he did not know why Charles had done such a horrible thing. He cooperated with the police investigation, but seemed more concerned that his wife's apartment and son's house remained locked so nothing would be stolen. He also spoke to the press and openly stated that he had abused his wife and 3 sons. And he said he taught his sons how to properly use firearms. Decades later, the book's author briefly interviewed Whitman's father. He was still a big fan of guns and had a Luger-shaped belt buckle. A few years after he lost his oldest son on the tower, his youngest was shot and killed in a bar fight. His other son died from AIDS. He ended up outliving his wife and 3 sons by many years. He then asked to be paid for the interview. There was a lot of criticism of the police's response and the fact it took over 90 minutes to end the sniping. It was clear they weren't prepared for an attack of that nature, but active shootings were less common at that time, and police agencies hadn't developed strategies for responding to them. Many officers focused their efforts on shutting down the area around campus, helping the wounded, or shooting back at Whitman from a distance. Columbine, which served as a catalyst for police agencies to adopt more aggressive responses by seeking to end the threat first, wouldn't occur for over 30 more years. A lack of rifles, communication problems from a lack of radios, and a difficulty getting into the tower all contributed to the messy response. On the other hand, sniping is an incredibly rare crime. Any police agency at that time would have struggled to respond. As far as I can tell, nobody in the Austin police force was fired or pressured to resign. There was also additional criticism of allowing Alan Crum, a civilian, to move with the lead officers. Though he did fire his gun accidentally, he was much more familiar with the tower than the officers, and did guide them on the upper floors. The University of Texas released Whitman's records and had a press conference where the psychiatrist that Whitman had seen read out his own notes on Whitman, which included Whitman's reference to shooting people from the tower. This generated a lot of talk, but given what the psychiatrist heard from Whitman, the psychiatrist's response was considered perfectly acceptable. Students had made dark comments about the tower plenty of times before, and it's common for people to have violent fantasies and never act on them. The governor of Texas at the time, John Connally, who had been in the limo with JFK when he was assassinated, created a group of experts to examine Whitman's physical and mental health. This commission did extensive research, noting the many stresses on Whitman and that he was aware that most people his age already had college degrees, made decent money, and had families. The commission could not come to a conclusion on his motive, or if he had a psychiatric disorder. The incident sparked debates on a range of issues. Some focused on the military, which was already getting more attention because of the Vietnam War, and pointed out that Whitman had been trained to be aggressive and efficient with killing, something he may have brought back with him to civilian life. Violence depicted on television, idea contagion from real-life violence reported by the news media, gun control, domestic violence, and drug use all sprang up as possible causes and potential remedies. It is not known if Whitman was on drugs during the shooting. His body was embalmed first, then autopsied, which prevented accurate drug analysis. Also during the autopsy, the doctor found that his skull was very thin and discovered one of the most infamous facts about this case. Whitman had a small, slightly malignant brain tumor under his thalamus and close to his amygdala, a part of the brain responsible for aggression, fear, and controlling emotions. Whether or not this tumor contributed to or outright caused his rampage has been debated endlessly. In the following years, 2 movies were made about the tower sniping. A television movie called The Deadly Tower loosely recreated the events of the attack, starring Kurt Russell as Whitman. McCoy and Martinez sued over its numerous inaccuracies. Another movie, Targets, starred Boris Karloff, portrayed a similar rampage, though it seemed to mix elements of a 1965 active shooting that took place on a highway in California. In the movie Full Metal Jacket, the Marine drill sergeant noted Whitman's accuracy as an example of how deadly a Marine could be. And the final note of the aftermath is how many people Whitman killed. There is a little bit of complexity to this. One of Whitman's victims was shot and injured on campus and taken to the hospital in an armored car. He would pass away in 2001 after A Sniper in the Tower was published from medical issues caused by the bullet. Including this victim, the unborn child, and Whitman's wife and mother. Whitman killed 17, 2 before he entered the tower, 3 inside the tower, and 12 from the observation deck. About 30 were injured. Thank you for watching my video. Again, most of the information I laid out comes from the book A Sniper in the Tower by Gary Laverne. This book has a much more in-depth retelling, so if you want the full story, I've linked the book in the description. The book got most of its material from files kept by the Austin Police Department and the Texas Department of Public Safety. The Texas tower sniping influenced my own novel, Tyler's Only Friend, about an active shooting at a party committed by a college student. When writing my book, I researched this case online. I actually didn't read A Sniper in the Tower until after I published Tyler's Only Friend, and the discussion about damage to the brain, possibly causing violent acts, changed how I thought about the roots of violence. Brain trauma is one of the potential contributing factors in Tyler's Only Friend because of this case. To give my own thoughts, I'll bring up some points made by the book and comment on them. One is that since Whitman's aim was so accurate, there is no way he was on any substantial amount of drugs. Reports of his drug use varied, but it's almost certain he wasn't an addict, and I don't think there was any cumulative effect on his mental health. The drugs may have caused his physical ailments, like the bad headaches and severe sweating. Of course, the tumor may have caused them, but the tumor was also small, measuring only a centimeter or 2. I looked into many Rampage killings as part of my research, and drugs rarely came up as a possible cause, so I personally don't think they were a factor. Another point the book makes is that Whitman's actions could be viewed as an elaborate act of revenge against his father, since Whitman believed death ended a person's suffering, and if his goal was to make his father suffer as much as he could, killing people close to his father would make sense. Whitman took his father's wife, daughter-in-law, and oldest son away from him, then attacked others at random to draw as much scrutiny, guilt, and shame on his father. Whitman expressed an extreme hatred of his father and left multiple letters placing blame on him. He took the time to damage his mom's wedding ring, both a literal and symbolic separation. Whitman wanted his mother to be free of him. He was very bitter about how his father treated him and his mother, and relatives claimed that his father cut off all financial help to both Whitman and his mother on July 30th, the day before Whitman showed signs he was preparing for the attack. However, Whitman never put this development in any of his letters. Certainly, Whitman was haunted by and obsessed with his father. Revenge against him is a likely factor. Ultimately, Whitman's revenge was realized. His other 2 brothers would die young, leaving his father to live on without any of his family. The book offers the suggestion that Whitman simply made the decision to do it. He was a coward who couldn't handle the pressure of classes, the pressure he put on himself, and the lack of success, nor could he summon the courage to face his father, and instead chose an easy way out. A way out that would grab attention and take as many other people with him while sparing his wife and mother of any shame. I don't think cowardice is enough to explain his brutality, but when I look for other clues, I run into a lot of difficulties. What's so odd about Whitman is how unusual he is from other Rampage killers. I found plenty of psychopaths, but Whitman didn't seem to be sadistic or remorseless, only frustrated. I found lots of injustice collectors who felt wronged by people over the slightest infractions and took revenge on society, but Whitman's letters don't convey this. He doesn't list out people he felt screwed him over, except his father, although his father really did do substantial harm to him. And Whitman didn't hold a grudge against society. I also kept finding severely mentally ill shooters who had trouble determining what was real and what wasn't, but Whitman was well aware of his actions and their consequences. What astonishes me are Whitman's well-written notes the evening before the attack, when he acknowledges he should be a reasonable young man, but kept having recurring irrational thoughts and powerful urges to harm others, even asking for an autopsy, as if he already knew he had a tumor. There are documented cases of sane, law-abiding people turning into criminals after developing a brain tumor, some covered in the Atlantic article I linked in the description. But for me, the tumor debate is a stalemate. I will add something that seems to be overlooked. And it is something I've seen in many active shooters, serial killers, and death row inmates. That is brain trauma. And not brain trauma from the tumor, but from the beatings he received from his father during his boyhood, and later on from the other Marines, made all the worse by his thin skull. I don't know if an autopsy in the 60s, performed after embalming, would have been able to detect signs of brain damage from numerous concussions. The book doesn't have anything about it. Ultimately, it appears Whitman is one of those cases where there are many factors involved, and everyone has a pet theory, but it does spark discussions on the harmful effects of abuse, brain damage, and dysfunctional families. As a final note, I did make some references to the Texas Tower shooting in my novel. The narrator mentions the case towards the end of the story because Tyler, the active shooter, had earlier in his life sustained brain trauma from being bullied. I actually made a mistake when the narrator says that Whitman killed 18 people when it was really 17. I wrote that section years ago and don't remember how I got the number. I might have double counted the victim who died decades later, or found a source that had the total number of people who died from the Rampage, which is 18 if you include Whitman. I also called the county that the novel takes place in Whitman County, both after Charles Whitman and the poet Walt Whitman. There were some odd accidental similarities too. Both Tyler and Charles Whitman were raised Catholic, and when I read A Sniper in the Tower, I was surprised to find that Whitman went to a high school called St. Anne's, the same name of the high school Tyler attended. I hope I did a good job of explaining this tragic story. I tried to be as concise and direct as I could. Feedback is appreciated. If you're interested in more videos about this type of crime, please see my channel. Again, thank you for watching.